One team makes the most sense as the ideal trade partner for the Chicago Bears to move down in the 2023 NFL Draft. All the other teams are mostly competing for second place.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lorin Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1. You can follow the podcast on Twitter at Locked On Bears. You can like Locked On Bears on Facebook. Join the Locked On Bears Facebook group for even more Bears talk. And make sure you hit that subscribe button on the Locked On Bears YouTube channel. That's going to be the best way to keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. Thanks for making the Locked On Bears podcast your first listen today. Today's episode is brought to you by Ultimate Football GM. Ever dreamed of becoming an NFL GM and managing your own football franchise? If so, then this game is definitely for you. To download the free game, just visit ultimate-gm.com or look it up on the app stores. Our listeners get a 100% free boost to your franchise when you use our promo code LOCKEDON in all caps in the game's store. On the show today, we look at the potential trade partners for the Chicago Bears to move down from the number one overall pick in this draft. I'll make the argument that really the Indianapolis Colts are the number one team the Bears should be looking to trade down with. After them, everybody else is kind of competing for second place. I think Houston has then the next best argument. But when you get to the Raiders and the Panthers and some of the other teams farther down the draft board in the first round, I don't know that there's a huge difference for the Bears which slot they end up in. So then it becomes who's got the best offer and what can they give us to make that big of a jump down. But really, the Indianapolis Colts are the most ideal trade partner for the Bears because of both where they're currently slated to pick, what their needs are in the direction of their franchise, and also some of what they're able to give up to the Chicago Bears in a potential trade down. Most importantly, though, I think the way the first four teams are aligned in this NFL draft, being able to get to the number 4 overall pick makes the most sense for the Chicago Bears, with the caveat of that we don't know exactly what Houston is going to do with that number 2 overall pick. But the ideal scenario for Chicago would be Indianapolis moving up to 1. You get a nice haul of draft picks and maybe some other players. We can get into that in a minute. And then you get to 4, and you have 2 quarterbacks go number 1 to the Colts, number 2 to the Texans. The Arizona Cardinals then take likely a defensive player, either Jalen Carter from Georgia or Will Anderson Jr. from Alabama. And then you, as the Bears, get whichever one of those 2 defensive players is left. You essentially get the same player that you would have wanted to take had you stayed at the number 1 overall pick, but now you get him 3 picks later and gained a significant amount of draft capital in that trade and maybe player capital in that trade, and really didn't really lose much other than perhaps your perfect choice between Carter and Anderson. And I think we're at this point in the draft where you might have a preference between one or the other. Certainly you should, but you're not going to be disappointed if you get one and not the other. You're going to be okay with either one. It's just a matter of which one do you like more, which one do you think is better, and which one do you get more excited about. But both are players to get excited about, and both are ideal landing spots for the Chicago Bears. Because if you go any farther than 4, which we'll get into in a moment here, your chances of either of those players still being available greatly diminishes. It's essentially 0. That if you drop all the way down to any of the other teams that might trade up lower than 4, those 2 guys are going to be off the board, and then you're looking at a very different pool of draft prospects. But 4 allows you to likely set up 2 quarterbacks going first, 1 defensive player off the board, and you still get one of the best defensive players in this draft. Plus, when you look at the kind of resources the Indianapolis Colts could give up. Every team has quality players that they might be willing to give up or, could be negotiated to give up in lieu of other additional draft picks. If, they're trying to build around a young quarterback that they're trading up for, they're not necessarily going to want to give away the best pieces that would support that quarterback. But you look at Indianapolis, and they've got certainly a wide receiver in Michael Pittman, who we've talked about as a potential trade target on this podcast before. He's coming in towards the end of his rookie contract, and there's some question as to whether or not the Indianapolis Colts will want to pay him that end of his rookie contract, especially with Alec Pierce being drafted in the second round last year, and they've got Paris Campbell being a free agent this year. If they're going to pay him some amount of money to come back, there's questions as to Michael Pittman's long-term fit with the Colts, and he could be a good young receiver that the Bears could get in a trade like this. The Colts also have a lot of salary cap space tied up in linebacker Shaquille Leonard, who hasn't been as great as he was, but is still a very, very good linebacker, and the Bears have a particular hole at linebacker. He's also quite expensive. He's also going to be well valued and represent a significant part of the trade and might drastically limit what other draft picks you're able to get in return from the Indianapolis Colts, but it would also represent a very significant salary cap savings for them to move him off of the roster. So there's some give and take there. And I think it's a similar conversation about DeForest Buckner on the defensive line. But you don't need me to explain the obvious connection of Matt Eberflus having coached both of those guys on that Indianapolis Colts defense. So, some combination of a future first-round pick, maybe the current second-round pick, and maybe one of those players, or maybe, additional picks, or not have the players, or more players, right? There's a lot of great things you can get out of the Colts, even in a fairly short move, that would still put the Chicago Bears in a position to take one of the best defensive players in this draft, one of the two players that really seem a full step above the rest of the draft class when we talk about best player available and the kind of really maximizing on having the high draft pick that the Bears do have this season. I know a lot of Bears fans want the idea of, well, why not trade down twice, right? Grab from 1 to 2 with the Houston Texans and then 2 to 4 with the Indianapolis Colts and get double the trade return. But coming up on Locked On Bears, we'll explain why that seems pretty unlikely of an option here based on where these teams are picking and what their team needs are, and yet still a potential trade with the Texans, even just from 1 to 2 and not jumping to 4, could still be on the books. We'll explain next on Locked On Bears. The Locked On Bears podcast is brought to you by our friends at the Ultimate Football GM app. Ultimate Pro Football GM puts you in complete control of your own NFL franchise. So when you're drafting, maybe at the top of the draft, you get to make those trade offers and you get to decide how far do you want to move down with your team. You can even make your team the Chicago Bears. You can even get the number 1 overall pick. Make those trades after making your free agent signings, your coaching hires, your coordinators, your scouts, your medical staff, your ticket prices, full control over your franchise. Plus, of course, going through the season and trying to win as many games as possible, all in a challenging and realistic game world. Ultimate Pro Football GM is completely free and playable offline as well. It's really a lot of fun. You got to check it out. Locked On Bears listeners will get 100% free boost to your franchise when you use our promo code Locked On in the game store. That's all caps, Locked On. So make sure to check it out today. To download the free game, just visit ultimate-gm.com or look it up in the app stores. That's ultimate-gm.com. Ultimate Football GM. Start your dynasty today. The Houston Texans are definitely this. I feel like the second best trade down option for the Bears to still get the player that they want and not lose out on talent, but still get some additional return on your pick and be able to move down and still land that guy. But I really don't think the double trade to go from 1 to 2 and then from 2 to 4 feels realistic, even if it's ideal. I agree. If you can get the Texans to move up to 1 and then the Colts to move up to 2, that would be ideal. And I think that would be the perfect situation to get, a double investment on getting your trade back, and then you'd still get the player one of the 2 defensive players that you wanted at 4, like we talked about with the Colts trade. But I just don't see that as super realistic, because if the Texans move from 2 to 1 which is a real possibility, to make sure that they get the quarterback and the Colts don't, then what's the Colts' incentive to go from 4 to 2? Their main competition then would just be other teams trying to trade up to 2 to get the second best quarterback, like the Raiders or the Panthers or some of these other teams. And that would be the only reason, because the Cardinals are not going to take a quarterback. And so if the Bears are sitting at 2, the Bears aren't going to take a quarterback. So the Colts are then sitting at 4, guaranteed to have, unless somebody trades to jump over them, guaranteed to have their next selection of the top quarterbacks in this draft. And I can't help but feel like in a draft class where there's no, at least right now, consensus, surefire, go-to quarterback. I think Bryce Young will be that guy. And I think when it's all said and done, we won't really be questioning. Like, Bryce Young is the top quarterback in this draft, is the best quarterback. And I don't think it's going to be this 50-50 debate on draft day on which quarterback is going to be drafted first. It's who's going to draft a quarterback first. Who will be the team that makes Bryce Young the first quarterback drafted. That's not what we're here to talk about today. But the point being that once Bryce Young is kind of established as that top quarterback, if a team goes up to 1 to get him, or the Texans take him at 2, I don't think there's going to be this big demand then to trade up into the top 4 to pass Indianapolis to make sure you get the second best quarterback in the draft class. We just don't necessarily see that consistently in draft years where there isn't some sort of consensus at quarterback, right? It was different in the Justin Fields, Trey Lance, Zach Wilson draft because Trevor Lawrence was at number 1, and everyone knew Trevor Lawrence was going to go 1, and there's not really anything you could do about it, and he's like the guy. So teams didn't have to worry about, oh, can we get Trevor Lawrence? We fall in love with Lawrence, can we go get him? Is there a way we can trade up and compete for that? It was like everyone was fighting for everything else after that. And some teams can fall in love and make some of those moves, but it doesn't become the same type of bidding war. We saw the 49ers move up, kind of early, before they knew exactly who their quarterback option was going to be at number 3. We weren't sure if it was Mac Jones or Trey Lance. It was very much kind of a messy situation trying to figure that out. And I just don't feel like in this draft class, a team like the Panthers or the Raiders is going to be sitting there saying, well, Bryce Young's off the board, so we got to make sure we go get CJ Stroud, or we got to make sure we go get Will Levis. We just don't tend to see in these kind of quarterback classes that huge clustering of everybody moving up to make sure they get their guy in the top 5, in the top 4 in this case. And I think they'll be willing to wait and see what Indianapolis does. And certainly we'll have to wait and see if Indianapolis signs a veteran quarterback, or if the Houston Texans add one of the 2 49ers quarterbacks that could be available. Jimmy G will be a free agent. Trey Lance may be available via trade. And certainly the teams that are quarterback needy could change between now and then. But it just doesn't seem like there's a lot of incentive and a lot of historical precedence for teams to want to trade up that aggressively to land the second best quarterback in a quarterback draft class that won't have a consensus number 2. It might eventually reach more of a consensus number 1, but I don't think we're going to get there and say, oh yes, CJ Stroud is clearly number 2 or Will Levis is clearly number 2. There's a lot of sort of split opinions on those guys, I think more so than Bryce Young, who the main red flag there is mostly just size. He's short and lightweight and durability question marks there. I still think he'll be kind of the guy, but I don't know that teams are going to be fighting over each other tooth and nail to say, I got to get Levis then. I got to make sure I get him because he's this can't miss quarterback prospect, because there isn't even a can't miss quarterback prospect. So it just brings the whole, expectations and the bar down. And I think that should also bring our expectations and our bar down for the potential trade value of being able to move down again once a team has already moved into the quarterback position at number 1 to make sure that they get the guy they like in this draft, likely going to be Bryce Young. I still think the Texans are kind of a wild card as to whether or not they are a quarterback team, if they get one of these other quarterbacks. But even if you just moved from 1 to 2, so the Texans make sure that they get their quarterback at number 1, they have an extra first-round pick next year, so they've got some extra draft capital. I think they also have an extra fourth-round pick next year as well, all from the Deshaun Watson trade. Plus, there have been rumors that they might want to trade Brandon Cooks, the wide receiver, to save some money, Titus Howard, the offensive tackle, is entering the last year, his fifth-year option year. They're not sure if he's a long-term piece for them, or even Malik Collins on the defensive line. Last year of his contract, a little bit expensive as well, but guys who can still be high-level contributors to a team like the Bears. If you're going to make that 1-2 swap, the Texans have a lot of capital to be able to make that move. Could also be capital that goes for Trey Lance, et cetera, but I like the idea of moving from 1-2 and still getting your shot at either Carter or Anderson and having your pick, the same pick you would be making at 1, but now you add a couple of other draft picks or whatever it might take to go from 1-2. But I just don't think, there's any reason for the Colts to want to jump the Cardinals in that regard. And I don't know if there's a lot of reason for all these other teams to really want to make sure they jump the Colts for the second best quarterback in a quarterback draft class that, maybe isn't going to wow you and have all these teams really fall in love with all of these guys. Now, once you get past the Texans and the Colts, I'm not sure that there's a huge difference on where you're drafting. Coming up, we'll look at what those options might be and what kind of considerations the Bears should have when you look at the next tier of prospects in this draft class. That's next on Locked On Bears. There is a difference between the 7th pick and the 9th pick and maybe the 11th pick and maybe the 13th pick as far as potential trade partners for the Chicago Bears, what's going to be available at those picks, and what teams are going to be willing to give up to move up from those picks all the way potentially up to the number 1 spot. But I'm not sure in terms of who the Bears may want to target in this draft. I'm not sure that there's a huge difference because you hit a spot in this year's draft class where you kind of enter this second tier of players after, if we think of Anderson and Carter are kind of like the top 2 non-quarterbacks that are like kind of in a league of their own. We can argue about that if you want to nitpick. Some people might like individual prospects a little bit more closer to that tier, but there's this consensus feeling that it's those 2 guys and then it's everybody else. So once those 2 guys are off the board, essentially by the 4th overall pick, we're kind of expecting those guys to be off the board, or at least the 5th overall pick. Certainly by the time you get to 7, those guys will be gone. This next group of everybody else, to me, there's a lot of guys that kind of are a similar level of talent to where it's not like, I got to make sure I land this guy. It's like, well, I'd like this guy, but if he's not there, I'd be pretty happy with this guy or that guy or that guy. And you feel like there's, 4, 5, 6, 7 different players that you would be happy with, whether you're drafting at 7, whether you're drafting at 9, whether you'd be more happy if you got him even later at 11 or 13. But it's not like, oh man, I can't trade lower than 7 because I got to make sure I land Peter Skoronski, the offensive tackle from Northwestern. He's a very good offensive tackle, and Bears fans would love to have Peter Skoronski holding up one of the 2 offensive tackle sides for Justin Fields for the next 10 to 15 years. But not to be a knock on Peter Skoronski, there's also Paris Johnson from Ohio State. Very good offensive tackle. Another guy who could be a 10 to 15-year guy on one of the sides for Justin Fields. There's also Broderick Jones from Georgia. Another guy with that potential to be that right tackle, especially, that just kind of locks that side down and feels like, you got a solid piece for the foreseeable future, a building block on your offensive line. There are certainly noticeable differences between those prospects. And honestly, I haven't sat and done deep dives on every single prospect available in the first round. It's not that you shouldn't have a preference between those guys or that some of those guys aren't better than each other, but how much of a difference is there? Is it really that noticeable? If you go to 9 and Skoronski's gone, you're going to be disappointed that you had to get Paris Johnson instead, or whatever order you might want them to be. Same thing with the wide receivers, right? Quentin Johnson from TCU, Jordan Addison from USC, Jackson Smith and Njigba from Ohio State, one of Justin Fields' teammates. Yes, you might rank those in a very specific order and want one over the other, but it's not like, at least from what I can tell so far, it's not like one of them is the wide receiver. You got to have this one, and the other ones just aren't as good. It's like, yeah, there's a difference between them, and it's not nothing, but you're not going to be disappointed if you end up with Jackson Smith and Njigba instead of Quentin Johnson or instead of Jordan Addison, because they're all talented first-round caliber wide receivers. I mean, even on defense, Miles Murphy from Clemson, the edge rusher, or the defensive lineman from Clemson, Brian Brees, maybe even Tyree Wilson, although he's probably going to go a little bit earlier. But it just seems like the gap between all, what number of players I said, 8 players that I mentioned so far, to varying degrees, you're going to be happy landing most of those players in mostly this kind of range, whether it's the Panthers at 7, the Raiders at 7, the Panthers at 9, the Titans at 11, or even the Jets as a surprise team maybe at 13 that could be interested in making a jump up to where the Bears are picking. And so to me, it's like, at that point, it's which team is the most desperate and will make the biggest trade haul offer. Obviously you'd think the later the pick, the Jets at 13 or the Titans at 11, the more they have to give up. Absolutely. But if they're not that desperate to move all the way up, then maybe they wouldn't be the bigger haul compared to like a team if Carolina is desperate at 9 and really wants to get Bryce Young. Maybe they throw in something a little bit extra that even beats what Tennessee or the Jets or whoever would be offering in there. And to me, that's what it becomes more about. It's like, who can give me the best combination of picks and players that I most like the offer to? And then I'm going to get a really good player at any of those spots. I don't feel like the player I get at 7 is going to be so much better than the player I could get at 13. You're right in this tier where, there are certainly guys you would prefer at 7 more than you would prefer at 13. But the actual difference in talent in this draft class, it feels like there's a glut right there of like, yeah, there's a bunch of good guys all in that range. So there's not really a huge benefit to being at 7 as opposed to at 13, unless you really think there's a guy that, or if somehow Carter or Anderson falls, that becomes a little bit of a different conversation. But you don't know that happens if you're at 1 and you're trading down from 1. You don't know who's going to fall. You're kind of going in blind. So you have to go, okay, if I'm at 7, who am I happy taking there? There's going to be 6 players off the board before that, and then everyone else will be left. Am I good there? Or at 9, there's going to be 8 players off the board. Is there a 9th player that I'm still going to be happy with if I trade down from that slot? It just feels like it gets a little bit negligible there, and it's not like, oh, the Panthers are this great trade target for the Bears because the 9th overall pick is some sweet spot to get a really good player. Like, there's just a lot of good players in that range. And all those teams have other young players on their roster that they could contribute in a trade as well. It's not like some glaring perfect match player that the Bears could acquire in that process. Not like the Colts, where you have Matt Eberflus's actual former players, and he would know these guys and be able to really kind of vouch for them and their character and how well of a fit they would be with the Chicago Bears. That's what makes the Colts truly the ideal trade partner. The Texans, also a good trade partner because of just the draft position. You still get your choice of the 2 guys and add some free trade compensation to move down 1. And then the rest, it's like, yeah, and they're not bad trades. You could likely get a bunch of picks, and that might be very well worth it for the Chicago Bears. But my point with this part of the podcast is just to say, like, the difference between trading to 7, 9, 11, and 13, to me, is I'm not scared to trade to 13. I'm not more scared to trade to 13 than I am scared to trade to 7, because you're going to miss out on Anderson and Carter. And so once those guys are gone, the class gets a little bit more similar in the level of talent between prospects, and you're more nitpicking which guy you like a little bit more than that guy, and how many of them are going to be available, each of those individual picks, and how desperate are those teams going to be to move up to give you the best possible draft haul to move that far down and make it worth your while to not have a chance at Carter or Anderson. That's really what the compensation has to be. Can you give me enough picks and players for me to sacrifice my chance to get Carter or Anderson and take a player who's still very good in the first round, but a step back? And that's when it becomes more the bidding war type conversation there, and why that they're not as ideal of trade partners as ideally the Colts, or maybe even just the Texans from 2 to 1 to make sure you get something. That's how I look at the Bears trade down options in this 2023 NFL draft. Would love to hear what you think. You can comment in the YouTube video for this Locked On Bears video podcast today. You can tweet us at Locked On Bears. You could post in the Locked On Bears Facebook group as well. There's a great way to keep up with even more daily Bears talk in there as well. So make sure you hit that subscribe button wherever you listen to the podcast, or on the Locked On Bears YouTube channel. You're keeping up with our in-depth daily Chicago Bears news and analysis. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. Make sure you come on back tomorrow for another episode of the podcast, and of course, another opportunity to bear down.